New York, October the 22nd, 1907. A crowd is forming on the corner of 5th Avenue and 34th Street, outside the marble headquarters of the Knickerbocker Trust Company, the third largest trust in the city. The people in that line want their money, all of it, in cash, right now. Inside, the tellers are paying out as fast as they can count. In a few hours, they will hand over around $8 million. And then, a little after noon, the money runs out, the doors close, and the Knickerbocker Trust stops paying. In 1907, when that happened, there was no institution in the United States whose job it was to stop it. No central bank, no federal deposit insurance, no lender of last resort, nothing. There was one man. He was 70 years old. He was not an elected official. He held no government position of any kind, and over the next 3 weeks, he would personally decide which American banks lived and which ones died. For one night in November, in the library of his own house, he would sit as something the United States did not officially possess and had spent a century refusing to build. A central bank, made of one man. To understand how the fate of the world's largest economy came to rest on the private judgment of a single elderly banker, you have to understand a decision the United States had made and remade for 70 years, which was the decision to have no one in charge of money at all. Most wealthy nations by 1907 had a central bank. Britain had the Bank of England. France had the Banque de France. These institutions did a specific and unglamorous job. When a panic hit and everyone demanded cash at once, the central bank could create liquidity, lend into the fear, and put a floor under the collapse. It was the adult in the room, and it had a fire hose. The United States had tried this. Twice. And twice it had killed the institution on purpose. There had been a first Bank of the United States, and its charter was allowed to lapse. There had been a second Bank of the United States, and President Andrew Jackson, who regarded a central bank as a monster of concentrated power, deliberately destroyed it in the 1830s. After that, America ran the largest and fastest growing economy on Earth with no central monetary authority whatsoever, on principle. The principle being a deep and genuinely old American fear of exactly the kind of concentrated financial power that, as we will see, the events of 1907 were about to place in the hands of one private man. Without a central bank, the American money system had a defect built directly into it, and everyone in finance knew about it. The currency was, in the language of the time, inelastic. The supply of cash could not stretch to meet demand. And every single autumn, demand spiked because the harvest had to be moved. Farmers in the interior needed physical money to be paid, so cash drained out of New York and into the countryside like a tide going out, every year on schedule. The banks of New York spent every autumn running low on reserves at precisely the moment the country needed them most. Most years the system groaned through it. Some years it broke. There had been a panic in 1873, another in 1884, a brutal one in 1893. Panics were not black swans in this system. They were a feature. The machine had no brakes, and roughly once a decade it went off the road. But by 1907, there was a new and much more dangerous pressure point, and it sat almost entirely outside the rules. The trust companies. A trust company looked to an ordinary depositor exactly like a bank. You could put your money in one. It paid interest. It felt solid, and the biggest of them occupied marble palaces designed to make you feel that your money was safe. But a trust company operated under far looser regulation than a national bank. It could take bigger risks, and crucially, it was required to hold far less cash in reserve against the deposits it owed. A national bank of that era might hold 25 cents in reserve for every dollar of demand deposits. A trust company might hold as little as 5. There is one more thing that mattered enormously and that no depositor was thinking about. The trusts were mostly not members of the New York Clearing House, the private association through which the established banks settled their accounts with one another, and in a crisis could support each other. The trusts had grown up outside that circle. They had grown fast, roughly quadrupling their assets in a decade, and they had grown alone. When trouble came, they had no siblings. These were the shadow banks of their age, bank-like institutions doing bank-like things, holding almost no cash, connected to no safety net. And in October of 1907, someone lit a match right next to them. The match was one of the strangest triggers in financial history because the panic that nearly destroyed the American economy started with a failed attempt to manipulate the price of a copper stock. A man named Otto Heinze, brother of a copper magnate, believed that short sellers were borrowing and dumping shares of a company called United Copper, so he tried to execute a corner. The plan was to buy up the stock aggressively, force the short sellers to buy it back from him at whatever price he demanded, and squeeze a fortune out of them. He was joined in the wider web by a financier named Charles Morse, who controlled a chain of banks. On the 16th of October, the corner failed, spectacularly. United Copper collapsed instead of soaring. The brokerage house running the scheme went under. And here is where a small, sordid stock manipulation turned into a national emergency because the men behind it were not just gamblers, they were bankers. The failure was traced straight into Morse's banks, and the moment depositors understood that the people who held their savings had just blown themselves up trying to corner a copper stock, they wanted their money back. The fear spread from bank to bank the way fear does, by association. And then it found the trusts. Charles Barney, president of the Knickerbocker Trust, had business ties to Morse. That was enough. That was the whole reason. Not fraud at the Knickerbocker, not insolvency that anyone had proven, simply the association, the whiff of connection to the copper disaster. The powerful National Bank of Commerce announced it would no longer clear checks for the Knickerbocker, which was a public signal that the established banks were cutting it loose. And the next morning, the line formed on Fifth Avenue. Barney, desperate, tried to get a meeting with the one man who could save him. He was refused. He was not judged worth saving. A few weeks later, Charles Barney shot himself. The man who refused to see him, the man the entire market was now turning to look at, was John Pierpont Morgan. By 1907, Morgan was already something the United States had never quite produced before and has arguably never produced since. He was a private citizen with more concentrated financial power than the government of the country he lived in. He was around 70. He was semi-retired. He was physically imposing, famously silent, with a disfiguring skin condition that made photographers dread him and made everyone else afraid to hold his gaze. And he had spent 40 years becoming the closest thing America had to a financial sovereign. When the nation's railroads had collapsed into chaos and overbuilding in the 1890s, it was Morgan who reorganized them, imposing order on entire industries from his private office, a process bankers of the era simply called Morganization. In 1901, he had assembled United States Steel, buying out Andrew Carnegie and merging his empire into the first corporation in history valued at over $1 billion. When Morgan sat down at a table, railroads merged, industries reorganized, and men who ran the largest companies in America waited to hear what he wanted. The government, by contrast, had almost nothing. The Treasury could move some deposits around, but it had no central bank, no emergency lending power, no real tools. Morgan had something the Treasury couldn't buy. He had a private intelligence network of the men who ran every major institution in New York. He had a personal fortune, and above all, he had the one asset that actually stops a panic, which is credibility. When Morgan said an institution was sound, the market believed him, and belief was the entire ballgame. When the panic broke, Morgan was not even in New York. He was hundreds of miles away in Richmond, Virginia, at a convention of the Episcopal Church, of which he was a devout and prominent member. As the reports came in from New York, he sat through the sessions, said little, and then, late, boarded a private train and traveled through the night back to the city. He arrived on a Sunday, checked into his brownstone, and by all accounts came down with a heavy cold. A 70-year-old man with a fever was about to spend 3 weeks holding up the financial system of the United States. The first thing Morgan did was refuse to panic and refuse to save everyone. He set up what amounted to a private command center and pulled in a team of younger financial experts, men who could read a balance sheet fast and tell him the truth. One of them was a rising banker named Benjamin Strong. Remember that name, because he closes this story. Their job was brutal and simple. Go into the trust companies, open the books overnight, and answer one question. Is this institution actually broke, or is it merely frightened? Because that was the rule Morgan imposed on the entire crisis, and it is the reason the rescue worked rather than simply burning his money. A run does not only kill weak banks, it kills healthy ones too, because no bank on earth keeps enough cash to pay every depositor at once. So the entire game was to separate the two. An institution that was solvent, whose assets were real and merely frozen, would be saved. An institution that was genuinely insolvent, that was broke underneath the marble, would be allowed to fail. Morgan was not going to throw good money after dead banks. He was going to find the ones worth saving and build a wall around them. The test case was the Trust Company of America, which came under assault next. Morgan's men went in, worked through the night, and came back with a verdict. It was sound. Its assets were good. It was suffering a run, not a collapse. Morgan said 4 words that became famous. This is the place to stop the trouble. And he meant it literally. The Trust Company of America would be the line. It would not be allowed to fall. And to hold that line, he needed cash, enormous quantities of it, faster than any private fortune could supply. So he went and got it from the people who had it, including the 2 institutions in America almost as powerful as he was, the federal government and John D. Rockefeller. If you are getting something out of this, take a second to subscribe. This channel takes apart the panics, the rescues, and the private deals that quietly built the financial system you live inside. And there is a new one every week, because the thing Morgan did next was not lending, it was command. The Secretary of the Treasury, George Cortelyou, came up from Washington and deposited around $25 million of federal money into New York's national banks, and then did something that tells you everything about where power actually sat that week. He effectively handed coordination of the entire rescue to Morgan. The government of the United States had money, but no plan, and no authority the markets respected. So it gave its money to a private banker and asked him to run the rescue. John D. Rockefeller, the richest man in the country, pledged tens of millions and made a point of saying publicly that he stood behind Morgan, because a public vote of confidence from Rockefeller was itself a tool for calming the fear. And then Morgan turned on the bankers of New York themselves. He summoned the presidents of the major institutions to his offices and made them a proposition that was not really a proposition. Each of you will contribute to a pool. That pool will be fed into the trusts under attack to keep them paying out, to keep the line from breaking. He decided the amounts. He applied the pressure. Men who ran enormous banks found themselves committing their own reserves because Morgan had looked at them across a table and made it clear that refusing was not on the menu. To keep the plumbing working while cash was scarce, the clearinghouse did something quietly radical. It issued loan certificates, a kind of emergency scrip that banks could use to settle balances with each other without moving actual money. It was, in effect, a temporary private currency invented on the spot to keep the system breathing. The banks were printing their own emergency money because the country had refused to build an institution that could do it properly. For a few days, the wall held. And then, on the 24th of October, the crisis moved to the one place that could turn a banking panic into a total economic collapse: the New York Stock Exchange. The exchange ran on call money, short-term loans that financed the buying and selling of stock, and the call money had simply vanished. Nobody would lend. Without it, trading could not happen, and the exchange was minutes from shutting its doors in the middle of the trading day. And a mid-session close was not an inconvenience. It was a signal flare that would tell every market in the world that the American financial system had failed, and it would turn the New York panic into a nationwide and then a global run. The president of the exchange, Ransom Thomas, hurried to Morgan and told him the exchange was about to close. Morgan's response was immediate and absolute. It must not close, not before the normal hour. He sent for the bank presidents once again, brought them to his office, and told them the exchange needed roughly $25 million right now to survive the afternoon. In a matter of minutes, standing in Morgan's office, the money was pledged. It was rushed to the floor of the exchange, where the news that call money was available at all set off a cheer. The exchange stayed open. It closed at its normal hour. Morgan had personally kept the securities markets of the United States open by force of will and a phone list, and the calls did not stop coming. The mayor of New York, George McClellan, came to Morgan to tell him that the city of New York itself, the municipal government, could not meet its obligations and was staring at bankruptcy. So Morgan's banking houses took around $30 million of New York City bonds and quietly saved the city government too. In the space of a fortnight, one private man had backstopped the trust companies, the stock exchange, and the largest city in the country. But the trusts were still bleeding, and Morgan understood that piecemeal rescue could go on forever unless he forced a permanent settlement. Which brings us to the night this entire story is remembered for. In early November, Morgan gathered the presidents of the trust companies at his home. Not his office. His home. Specifically, the private library he had built next to his brownstone on 36th Street, a marble palazzo housing one of the great manuscript collections in the world, its walls lined with rare books and Renaissance art. He put the trustmen in one room. He put the presidents of the national banks in another, and he told them, in essence, that they were going to solve this among themselves tonight by agreeing to put up the money to save the weakest trusts, and that nobody was leaving until they did. And here we reach the single most famous detail of the night, and it deserves an honest handling, because this is a channel that follows the documents rather than the legend. By many accounts, Morgan locked the doors of the library and put the key in his own pocket, physically trapping the most powerful bankers in America inside his house until they agreed to his terms. It is one of the most repeated images in the whole history of American finance. Is it literally, provably true, down to the turning of a key? The accounts vary, as accounts of a long tense night written down afterwards always do, and some historians treat the locked door as the dramatized version of what was, in substance, a very real thing. Morgan absolutely gathered them, absolutely held them there into the early morning, and absolutely refused to let the meeting end without an agreement. Whether the lock was literal, or the pressure simply made leaving unthinkable, the effect was identical. These men were not free to go until they had signed. He had a document drawn up committing the trust companies to supply around $25 million to rescue their own weakest members. He is said to have laid it on the table, placed a pen beside it, and waited, through the small hours, until near dawn the first president stepped forward and signed, and then the rest followed. Morgan had forced the private financial establishment of the United States to bail itself out in his library overnight, under something between persuasion and captivity. By the time the sun came up, the essential structure of the rescue was in place, but there was one more piece, and it is the piece that reveals the price of being saved by a private man with private interests. A major brokerage house, Moore and Schley, was on the brink of failure. It was propped up by a large block of shares in a company called the Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company, one of the biggest producers in the South, and a competitor to Morgan's own United States Steel. If Moore and Schley collapsed, that stock would be dumped, the panic would reignite, and the whole fragile structure could come down. Morgan's solution solved the crisis and happened to be extraordinarily good for Morgan. United States Steel would buy the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company. That would take the dangerous shares off the market, save the brokerage, and calm the fear. It would also hand Morgan's steel monopoly one of its most significant rivals, at a price many considered a bargain, in the middle of an emergency in which the seller could hardly say no. There was only one obstacle. United States Steel was already an enormous monopoly, and the President of the United States at that moment was Theodore Roosevelt, the most aggressive trustbuster in American history, a man who had built much of his political identity on breaking up exactly these kinds of combinations. Buying Tennessee Coal would make U.S. Steel bigger and more dominant, precisely what Roosevelt existed to prevent. So Morgan sent 2 emissaries overnight to Washington, and they reached the president at the White House before breakfast on the 4th of November. They laid it out. Either U.S. Steel absorbs Tennessee Coal and the panic is contained, or the deal is blocked, the brokerage fails, and the crisis reignites with the whole country watching. Roosevelt, staring at the possibility of a full financial collapse on his watch, said he did not feel it was his duty to object. The deal went through. Critics said then, and have said ever since, that Morgan used a national emergency to swallow a competitor at a discount with the personal blessing of the one man in America who was supposed to stop him. Defenders said he stopped a depression, and the Tennessee coal purchase was the necessary price. Both of those things can be, and probably are, true at once. And that is the uncomfortable center of the entire Morgan rescue. The man saving the system was also a player in it, and every life or death decision he made about which institutions survived was made by someone with enormous private interests in the outcome. Now, before we go further, one correction, because it is the single most common thing people get wrong about 1907. You may have heard that a small group of bankers met in secret on an island called Jekyll Island to engineer all of this. That is a real event, and it involved some of these same men, but it is not this event. The Jekyll Island meeting happened 3 years later, in 1910, and its purpose was to secretly draft the banking legislation that would eventually become the Federal Reserve. It was a meeting about the future, held after the panic, the rescue you have just heard about, the runs, the library, the locked door, the Tennessee coal deal. All of that was real, public in its outlines, and thoroughly documented by the people who lived it. The Jekyll Island drafting session is downstream of the panic. It is a consequence, not the cause. Collapsing the two into one secret conspiracy is the mistake, and it buries the far more interesting truth, which is that the rescue really did depend on the private judgment of one mortal man, out in the open, with the whole country watching him do it. Because the panic ended. That is the part that is easy to forget under the drama. Morgan's system held. Confidence slowly returned over the winter. The runs subsided, and by the early months of 1908, the crisis was over. The rescue had worked, and that is exactly what terrified the people who had watched it. Step back and look at what had actually happened. The financial system of the largest economy on Earth had come within hours of total collapse, and it had been saved not by any institution, not by any law, not by any permanent mechanism, but by the personal fortune, private information, and individual willpower of one 70-year-old banker with a bad cold. It had worked because that particular man happened to be alive, happened to be willing, happened to command the trust of the markets, and happened to be in a position to lock the others in a room until they complied, and every one of those conditions was temporary. Morgan was 70. He was not going to be there forever, and there was no successor with anything like his authority. The next time the tide went out in the autumn, the next time a copper corner, or a bad harvest, or a failed trust set off a run, who exactly was going to gather the bankers, audit the trusts overnight, and stand in the doorway with the key? The rescue of 1907 was a demonstration of a strength and a terrifying admission of a weakness in the same breath. The system had no brakes of its own, so it had borrowed a man, and men die. This is the paradox that finally built America's central bank, not the failure of Morgan, the success of Morgan. It was precisely because he had done the job so well and so visibly that the country could no longer pretend it did not need the job done. A nation that had spent 70 years killing central banks on principle had just watched its entire economy hang from the judgment of a single private citizen, and the people in power found that they could not live with what they had seen. Even the men who most distrusted concentrated financial power now understood that the alternative to a public central bank was not freedom from financial masters. The alternative was J.P. Morgan, so the machinery of reform began to turn. In 1908, Congress passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, which set up a National Monetary Commission under Senator Nelson Aldrich to study how other countries prevented panics and to design something better. That commission's work and the secret drafting at Jekyll Island in 1910 fed into years of political fighting over what an American central bank should look like, and above all, who should control it. The old fear had not gone away. It simply lost the argument. On the 23rd of December, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act. The United States, at long last, had a central bank, a public lender of last resort, designed to do permanently and by institution exactly what Morgan had done privately and once: to create liquidity in a panic, to be the adult in the room, to hold the fire hose, so that the survival of the financial system would never again depend on whether one particular man was alive and willing and in town. The timing has a grim symmetry to it. John Pierpont Morgan died in March of 1913 in Rome, 9 months before the Federal Reserve Act was signed. He did not live to see the institution built to replace him. He had, in the most literal sense, been the central bank of the United States in his own person, and the country only built the real one once it was clear he would not always be there to be it. And there is one last thread, and it is the one that ties the whole thing shut. Remember Benjamin Strong, the young banker Morgan sent into the trust companies in 1907 to open the books overnight and tell him which ones were worth saving. When the Federal Reserve was created, Benjamin Strong became the first head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and through the 1920s, he was the single most powerful figure in the American central banking system, effectively running it. The man Morgan had trained in the library rescue became the man who ran the institution designed to make that rescue unnecessary. The private judgment of 1907 was institutionalized into the public system of the 1920s, carried across by the same human being. That is the real inheritance of the panic, not a conspiracy on an island, a machine deliberately built to do a job that had been done once by a mortal man, and that no one ever wanted to depend on a mortal man to do again. You can see the whole logic of it play out one more time within living memory. In 2008, when the financial system froze again, the men gathering the banks in a room and deciding who would be saved and who would be allowed to fail were not private financiers acting on their own fortunes. They were the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, public institutions, wielding public power, doing openly and by law what Morgan did privately and by force of personality in his library. That is the difference a century made. The mechanism became public, but the deepest questions that Morgan's night raised did not go away, and they never will. In every rescue since, someone still has to decide which institutions are solvent and which are broke. Someone still has to decide who gets saved and who is allowed to fail. Someone still has to decide what the price of the rescue will be and who pays it and who quietly profits from it. In 1907, all of those decisions were made by one man, behind the locked door of his own library, by the light of his own fire. We built an institution so that it would never again come down to one man in one room. The questions he answered that night are still the only questions that matter. We just have more people in the room now. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. Next week, I am taking apart the 20 years of political warfare between that panic and the signing of the Federal Reserve Act, and the fight over the one thing everyone in 1907 had just learned to fear, which was the question of who, in the end, should be allowed to control the money. The rescue is the story everyone tells. The machine they built afterwards is the one that actually runs your life.